Jacksonville, born and raised there, and I was homeschooled all the way through. So we're going to expand upon several different subjects, but all in relation to American patriotism and what makes it unique to America at its founding during the American Revolution War and thereafter. So I'm dressed up as a Minuteman from the American Revolution. Do you know what a Minuteman is? Like why they're called a Minuteman? Because they had to be ready on a minute's notice if the British were attacking the town. But Minutemen were volunteer. So this was a volunteer service. They didn't get paid. And militia would be composed of Minutemen. So in South Carolina, you had to distinguish yourself some way, specifically in South Carolina, from Tories. So you know what Tories are? How about loyalists? You know what loyalists are? So you had to distinguish yourself from them in some way, shape, or form. So like Marion and his men, they would either have a tail or a feather in their hat to symbolize that they were a patriot, or they would refer to themselves as Republicans in South Carolina. So by this tail or feather in my hat, I would be on the patriot side. I'd be for breaking away from the crown of England. So to talk about a little bit more what I have a tomahawk, and I have a pistol, and this is just, things that, they might have had back then. Tomahawks, they would have in place of a bayonet, because a lot of the Minutemen would have a rifled musket, meaning it was a hunting musket. So for like a bird gun or a squirrel gun and stuff like that, small caliber, it was rifled, so that musket ball would spin, making it very, very accurate compared to the brown vest. The brown vest here, it has a fixture where you can have a bayonet. So if it came down to close combat or things of that nature, the Minutemen would often have something smaller that they could fight, like a tomahawk, and doing trades with the Indians. So this would be a very common gun during the American Revolution. Again, this is a 1730 model brown vest musket. It's a 75 caliber round. Let's see. I want to say I have one in my pocket. Yes. If you like to pass this around, you can, because just to get the feel, the weight of that musket round, it's almost 1.5 ounces of lead. So that's what this gun right here would shoot. And I live fired it, and at my house in the woods and shooting it, you can hear it hit the tree. You just hear a distinct sound. You see the bark blow off, so you know right where it hit the tree. But these weren't made for accuracy. These were just made to aim in the general direction where the troops were, and you fire in that direction. So say if I was shooting at one particular person, trying to hit them right into this button, just right there, I'm not going to hit that button. I'm going to hit them in the general area. So these were made for reloading, firing very quickly in a line of troops. Francis Marion, being a veteran of the French and Indian War, he had his own experience with the French and Indian during the French and Indian War, where roughly, I want to say 2/3 of a group of British men that he was with were lost from an attack from the Indians, and he got to witness that firsthand and what being attacked from Indians were, as in you can't see them because they're hiding behind trees and bushes where they were drilled troops where they had to have orders and this line, fire that way and all that. They weren't used to being ambushed. So Francis Marion had that experience happen to him prior to the American Revolution. So a little bit more about this though. You have your flint, then you have your frizzen where the flint was struck. It would create the spark. It would flip open. Then you have your powder pan right here, and you have a breech hole, which would then light this powder, go into the breech hole, then light the chamber where the rest of the powder was then fire. These were not very reliable guns, flintlock. Just to say as a whole, maybe out of 10 times of attempting to fire, it might really only shoot 6 or 7 out of 10 attempted times. So you have the bayonet. Do you know what the purpose of the bayonet originally was for? Well, just to say, before the bayonet came around, you had pikemen. And a pikeman had like a 6-foot staff with a blade on it. Say late 1600s, mid 1600s, around about there, up into the early 1700s. If you had a cavalry charge, you'd call your pikemen forward, and they would defend the men with the pike from the horses, because the horses were trained like machines just to charge and not stop. So bayonet France, the bayonet came around, It was designed to fix onto the rifle. So now you no longer needed pikemen, so your riflemen are your pikemen. But it was designed for the horse, because the horse would come charging, and they would take that, thrust it into the horse, which would then cause the rider to fall, and then you finish off the rider. So that's where the bayonet came from. I don't mind doing this if you'd like to pass that around, where if you look at the shape of it, and you can feel it, it's a triangular shape. This was a wound, or it created a wound that you couldn't stitch back together. So very hard to heal, very easy to get infected and all that. And of course, during the war, a lot more men from both sides died from infections and gangrene and things of that nature than just a KIA, being killed in action. So, yeah, that would be a bayonet for the brown vest. So, what made American patriotism very specific to America? I'd like to read to you this excerpt from this book here. This book was printed back in 1821, but there's prints older than this one. This is just one that I was able to obtain, but it's the life of General Francis Marion, the celebrated partisan officer of the Revolutionary War against the British and Tories in South Carolina and Georgia. So this goes into full detail of the war in South Carolina. But to read to you this part here, I'd like to read to you this dialogue that took place between a British officer and Francis Marion. And we're going to jump down a little bit further into the dialogue, but just to tell you what was going on. It was a custom at that time that if you're trying to work a peace out or something with the enemy, someone could come blindfolded into the camp, the officer, and try to work out something with the other camp. So a British officer came to Francis Marion's camp. And everyone's familiar with Francis Marion? Yes. Have you? Okay. So Francis Marion, he was a brigadier general in South Carolina. He was in charge of all the militia. And he was a dedicated Christian man. And just to read you a little bit more, from this book, this is Francis Marion now addressing this British officer, talking about pay and what type of food they eat. So, let's see. Marion looked surprised. "I beg pardon, General," said he, "but one cannot, always command his conceits. I was thinking how drewly some of my brother officers would look if our government were to give them such a bill of fare as this, because they're eating yams off tree bark." And the British officer was like, that was below him. So this is Marion's response. Marion said, "I suppose it is not equal to their style of dining." "No, indeed," quoth the officer. "And this, I imagine, is one of your accidental late dinners, a sort of banyan. In general, no doubt you live a great deal better." "Rather worse," answered the general. "Far often we don't get enough of this." "Heavens," rejoined the officer. "But probably what you lose in meal you make up in malt, though stinted in provisions you draw noble pay." "Not a cent, sir," said Marion. "Not a cent." "Heavens and earth! Then you must be in a bad box. I don't see, General, how you can stand it." "Why, sir," replied Marion, with a smile of self-approbation, "these things depend on feeling." The Englishman said he did not believe that it would be an easy matter to reconcile his feelings to his soldier's life on General Marion's terms. All fighting, and no pay, and no provisions but potatoes. "Why, sir," answered the general, "the heart is all, and when that is much interested, a man can do anything. Many youth would think it is hard to indent himself as a slave for 14 years, but let him be head over heels in years of love, and with such a beauteous sweetheart as Rachel, and he will think no more of 14 years servitude than young Jacob did," talking about Jacob in the Bible. "Well now, this is exactly my case. I am in love, and my sweetheart is liberty. Be that heavenly nymph my companion, and these wilds and woods shall have charmed beyond London and Paris of slavery. To have no proud monarch driving over me with his gilt coaches, nor his host of excise men and tax gatherers insulting and robbing me, but to be my own master, my own prince and sovereign, gloriously preserving my national dignity and pursuing my true happiness, planting my vineyards and eating their luscious fruits, sowing my fields and reaping the golden grain, and seeing millions of brothers all around me equally free and happy as myself. This, sir, is what I long for." And just to pause right there. I believe that that would be the best definition of the American dream, is what Francis Marion just explained to the British. So the British officer replied that both as a man and a Briton, he most certainly subscribed to this as a happy state of things. Happy, quoth Marion. Yes, happy indeed. And I'd rather fight for such blessings for my country and feed on roots than to keep aloft the wallowing in all the luxuries of Solomon. For now, sir, I walk this soil that gave me birth, and I exult in the thought that I am not unworthy of it. I look upon these venerable trees around me, and I feel that I do not dishonor them. I think of my own sacred rights and rejoice that I have not basely deserted them. And when I look forward to the long ages of posterity, I glory in the thought that I am fighting their battles. The children of distant generations may never hear my name, but still, it gladdens my heart to think that I am now contending for their freedom with all its countless blessings. So it goes on to say about the British officer. On his return to Georgetown, talking about that particular British officer, he was asked by Colonel Watson, who was a British officer, why he looked so serious. I have cause, sir, said he, to look so serious. What, has General Marion refused to treat? No, sir. Well then, has old Washington defeated Sir Henry Clinton and broke up our army? No, sir, not that either, but worse. What could be worse? Why, sir, I have seen an American general and his officers without pay and almost without clothes, living on roots and drinking water, and all for liberty. What chance have we against such men? It is said Colonel Watson was not obliged to him for this speech, but the young officer was so struck with Marion's sentiments that he never rested until he threw up his commission and retired from the service. So it's interesting reading books about Francis Marion that are like new. It makes mention that this is like a legend has it. Well, this is as old as it can get, just about. And reading it, it's always good to find first, sources, as in like the person who experienced it. If you're really doing in-depth, research, because you can look at these other books that are written from books, and then a lot of times it can just be changed because authors have to change things so they can copyright it. So that's why it's best to go ahead and find the old books and read them. And once you find them, hold on to them. So that's a little dialogue with Francis Marion and the British officer. But this is all in relation to American patriotism, and I'd like to expand on that more. This is from the same book. So at this time, Francis Marion and his men, they're roughly numbered at 200. But all of a sudden, these men found out that the Tories and the Loyalists were planning such a huge attack that many of his men got discouraged and started to leave the camp. They started to lose their numbers. So this would take place in like the summer of 1780, right about there. Summer, late summer, right about there, 1780. So this is Francis Marion's address to the men that still remain. It is not for words to express what I feel when I look around upon your diminished numbers. Yesterday I commanded 200 men, men whom I gloried in, and who I finally thought would have followed me through any dangers for their country. And now, when their country most needs their services, they are nearly all gone. And even those of you who remain are, if report be true, quite out of heart, and talk that you and your families must be ruined if you resist any longer. But my friends, if we shall be ruined for bravely resisting our tyrants, what will be done to us if we tamely lie down and submit to them? In that event, what can we expect but to see our own eternal disgrace and the widespread ruin of our country, when our bravest and best citizens shall be hung up like dogs, and their property confiscated to enrich those villains who deserted their country and joined her enemies, when Cornwallis, Rowden, and Tarleton, after so long plundering and murdering your friends, shall in reward of such services be set over you as your governors and lord lieutenants, with princely salaries out of your labors, when foreign bishops and their hireling clergy shall be poured upon you like hosts of consecrated locusts, consuming the tithes and the fat of the land, when the British princes and nobles and judges shall swarm over your devoted country, thick as eagles, over a new fallen carcass, when an insatiate king, looking on your country as his plantation, and on your children as his slaves, shall take away your substance every year for his pomps and pleasures, and to keep you under forever, shall fill your land with armies, and when those armies, viewing you with malignant eyes, shall constantly be insulting you as conquered rebels.
and under the pretense of discovering among you another rebellion, shall be perpetually harassing and giving up to military execution to the best and worthiest of your fellow citizens. I know that's a mouthful. Now, my brave brethren in arms, is there a man among you who can bear the thought of having to see his dear country and friends in so degraded and a wretched state as this? If there be, then let that man leave me and retire to his home. I ask not his aid, but thanks be to God, I have no fears about you now. Judging by your looks, I feel that there is no such man among us. For my own part, I look upon such a state of things as 1,000 times worse than death. And God is my judge this day, that if I could die 1,000 deaths, most gladly would I die 1,000 deaths, all rather than to live to see my dear country in such a state of degradation and wretchedness. Those are the words of Francis Marion, the swamp fox. You know what happened shortly after that? They won. So looking at this closer, though, what gave these men the courage and strength to stand up against the opposing foe? Was it money? No. Was it having enough troops? No. Was it having enough arms? Not these arms, but firearms and ammunition and all that and food? No, it wasn't any of that. So what was it then? Well, there's another book, the Bible. These men had such a faith in the Bible that you don't hear about today. And it's the very element that led them to a victory because they praised God for these victories. Let me read you something else. I wasn't planning for this, but with that in mind, let me read to you. It's called God's Actions and Protections During the War. But Peter Horry, he was an officer of Francis Marion, Colonel Peter Horry. He served directly underneath him. So this is jumping into the middle of the dialogue, but Horry made mention of several instances where God worked out wonderful things for the Patriots during this time. So jumping into this dialogue with him talking about it, raging like a wounded tiger, Cornwallis destroys all his heavy baggage and pushes hard after Morgan. This is directly after the Battle of King's Mountain. The pursuit is urged with unimaginable fury, and Cornwallis gains so fast upon the Americans, encumbered with their prisoners, that on the evening of the 9th day he came up on the banks of the Catawba, just as Morgan's rear had crossed at a deep ford. Before the wished-for morning returned, the river was so swollen by a heavy rain, Cornwallis could not pass. Adoring the hand of heaven, the Americans continued their flight. On the morning of the 3rd day, Cornwallis renewed the pursuit with redoubled fury, and by the 9th evening came up to the banks of the Yadkin, just as Morgan's last rifle corps was about to take the ford. Presently, the rain came rushing down in torrents, and by the morning light, the furious river was impossible. So twice rivers flooded that allowed, first Marion was able to cross Morgan, and then the rivers flooded where the British couldn't pursue him. Who is so blind as not to acknowledge the hand of God in all this? Soon as he could get over, the wrathful Cornwallis renewed the pursuit, but before he could overtake them at the Guilford courthouse, the Americans, joined by their countrymen, gave him battle and killed 1/3 of his army. Cornwallis then in turn fled before the Americans, and as he had outmarched them before, he outran them now and escaped safely back to Wilmington. With a largely recruited force, he returned to Virginia, where 400 deluded men, Tories, that's what the Patriots would call them. They would call them the deluded men. But they're the Tories, under Colonel Piles, came forward to join him. On their way, talking about the Tories, they fell in with Colonel Lee and his legion. Do you recognize that name? Henry Lightfoot Lee?
Yes.
Or the Lightfoot? You know who he is related to?
Robert E.
Robert E. Lee. That's right. So mistaking them for Tarleton and his cavalry, mistaking Colonel Lee for British, they waved their hats and they cried out, "God save the King! God save the King!" Lee encourages the mistake until they are all intermixed with his dragoons, who at his signal given draw their swords and hewed the wretches to pieces. only 100 make their escape. So just to say what happened, the Tories thought that Lee's men were fellow Tories. They fell in. Lee encouraged them to escape, and then when he gave the signal, roughly 300 of them, the Tories were killed. So now only 100 make their escape. These fall in the next day with Colonel Tarleton, an actual British officer, who, mistaking them for what he called, I won't say what he called them, but rebels, ordered his troops to charge, which they did. And regardless of their repeated cries that they were the king's best friends, put most of them to death. So friendly fire is what Tarleton did to the rest of the Tories. Thus wonderfully did God baffle Lord Cornwallis and visit a sudden and bloody destruction upon those unnatural wretches who were going forth to plunge their swords into the bowels of their own country. After this, being joined by all the British troops in that quarter, he rolled on like an angry flood to Williamsburg and York, where God sent his servant Washington, who presently captured him and his fleet and army near 10,000 strong. So there's an eyewitness account of how God worked just in some of those ways in South Carolina. That's not to mention everything else. So let's talk about, you have the American flag. You have red, white, and blue. Red representing courage, blood spilled. White representing purity, and blue representing justice. Do you know what the definition of patriotism is? Have you ever heard it? You know, in general, we always think of just, the love of the country and all that, which is correct, but it's a little bit more in depth. So patriotism from Noah Webster's Dictionary of 1828 is defined as the love of one's country, the passion which aims to serve one's country, either in defending it from invasion or maintaining its laws and institutions in vigor and purity. Patriotism is the characteristic of a good citizen, the noblest passion that animates a man in the character of a citizen. So if we notice two words in the definition of patriotism, purity and good, that goes back to God's word. That's what the color white represents. According to Ephesians chapter 5, talking about the man and the woman getting married, in the biblical sense as the Bible describes marriage, Christ came, and when he died on the cross and you ask him into your hearts to forgive your sins, then it says in the Bible that he washes them whiter than snow, hence the color pure. So when the bride comes and is wearing the white dress, just like as Christ comes and sees his church that is washed clean with his blood, that's the same thing why the bride wears white. It all represents purity. So that's in our American flag. But something else, talking about good, do you know that good and God in the Hebrew tongue are synonymous with each other? In Matthew chapter 7, it talks about the man who built his house on a rock and a man who built his house on sand. Of course, we know what happened. Rain came, like today, wind blew, and all that. But you know what house stood. But do you know why it stood? It was built on the solid rock. Now, we can build all kinds of things on sand. I can build my life on me. But that's not what God says. And love is sacrifice. No man hath any greater love than this, and to lay his life down for his friend. That's what a lot of veterans did that are, with us today, looking from the American Revolution all the way up to today. So, when we think about all of that, we wonder what happened today. Why is our country in such a turmoil as it is? Well, it starts with the family. It starts with the family structure. It starts with children. And the Bible has a lot to say when it comes to children. Just a few verses that came to my mind I'd like to share with you. If you have a Bible, feel free to turn there. If not, then that's okay too. I'll be reading them. But looking at the book of Proverbs, look at Proverbs chapter 13, verse 24. It says this, He that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth in the times.